What else did I want to tell you about? Well, almost in the summertime, every afternoon about 3 o'clock, you'd see about a half a dozen or a dozen paper boys all sitting on the curb under a big oak tree in the busiest corner in Excelsior, waiting for those trucks to roll in and dump off those bundles. And we were always quick to open up one bundle and turn to the funny pages to see what Buck Rogers was doing in the 25th century. Buck Rogers and his girlfriend Wilma. And the villain was a guy called Killer Kane, if I remember. And we read Dick Tracy and all the others, but Buck Rogers was the big thing. And I peddled handbills for 3 different grocery stores in downtown Excelsior. Every Thursday and Friday I would peddle those bills. And I got $2 each for doing that for each one of those. I was making pretty good money then. I was mopping floors for another $2, and but between that and my paper route, I was probably doing pretty well for the Depression years. Anyway, one of the flyers that I peddled one Saturday for the Red Owl stores was a penny pork chop sale. Can you imagine? Pork chops were a penny a piece during the Depression on this sale. They were about that thin, but they were still a pork chop, and they only cost a penny. And we thought that was wonderful. We thought that was big time. Well, what else did I want to tell you about that same thing? Well, back in those days, most of us didn't have refrigerators. We had ice boxes. And we had a lot of kerosene stoves rather than electric stoves. My wife Patty grew up, she was raised by her grandparents. Her mother died when Patty was about a year old. And she was raised by her grandparents, and her grandfather owned the ice company in Excelsior called the Morris Brothers Ice Company. And that's when most people had ice boxes. And if you can remember, if you were in that time period, and if you remember, you used to have an ice card. It was about this square, and it had 4 numbers on it, 25, 50, 75, and 100. Those were the sizes of the blocks of ice that you would ask for. And the different ice boxes held different sizes. And so if you had an ice box that held 25 pounds and you needed ice, you put that in the window or the screen door or wherever, and the iceman would see that and come and deliver a block of ice for you. And just about that time, the ice company was being threatened by those newfangled electric refrigerators. And so they had to do something about that. So they gave all of their customers an ice pick. And on the handle, it said, Morris Brothers Ice Company, call Excelsior 9. That was the phone number. We didn't have dial phones or push-button phones or anything like that. You picked up the phone and you heard a voice on the other end that said, one of 2 things, operator or number please, one of those 2 things. And then you would give them the number. If you wanted to call the ice company, you'd call Excelsior, give me Excelsior 9. It just so happened, by the way, that the number for the Excelsior Theater at that time was Excelsior 5. And sometimes the operator would misunderstand, and somebody who was trying to call the theater got Patty's home number, the ice company number. And they got so many calls that instead of referring them to the right number, they just put a schedule up on the wall next to the phone and told them what was playing at the theater. And back in those days, you could recognize some of the voices of the telephone operators. So you could pick up the phone and say, oh, Gert, Patty and I are going to go over to the Starks tonight to play cards. So if there are any phone calls for us, just send them over to the Starks and we'll pick the phone up. Well, you couldn't do that now, but that's what you used to be able to do back in the old days. And so, and Patty, her granddad was always out politicking because he was a county commissioner. And so she stayed at home on Sunday afternoons, and they had a small ice box, or ice house on a boulevard right by the back door. So if fishermen needed ice, they could come there and pick up 25 pounds and put it on their back bumper until they could get where they wanted to put their fish in it. Or if somebody ran out of ice, they could stop there. And Patty, of course, on the hot summer days, would sit inside that ice house and read comic books. But in the meantime, if she had to, she could cut a 100-pound chunk of ice into 425 chunks, just as slick as a whistle. Of course, today she can't even get the ice cubes out of the refrigerator, but she was very good at that.
And what did it say on those ice picks?
On those ice picks? Yes, just to make sure that the electric companies didn't get too many refrigerators in. They always had a slogan that said, "A block of ice never gets out of order." How about that? A block of ice never gets out of order. So anyway, those are memories that I have, and they're fond memories. And when I went into service in 1942 to the Air Force, actually it was called the Army Air Corps in those days, we still had an ice box, and we still had a kerosene stove. And well, I should tell you one other story about Patty, because Patty was raised by her grandparents, and they had a large family, and they all went to the Congregational Church. And I grew up going to Trinity Episcopal Church in Excelsior. So when we got engaged, her family was very quick to tell her and explain to her that the bride had the choice of where she wanted to go be married. And it just so happened that Patty decided she wanted to be married at Trinity Church rather than in the Congregational Church. And so I always felt kind of bad about that whole thing, because all those Congregationalists came for the wedding, and I don't know what they expected, but we had been singing in the choir, so our procession, and of course Episcopalians love to process anyway, anywhere, and so the procession included a crucifer, an acolyte holding a cross, then 2 flag bearers, then 2 candle bearers, then a full choir, then the priest. This was before the wedding group even started down the aisle. And I'm sure that those poor Congregationalists thought by that time that the Pope was going to come through the front door at any moment. But it was a wonderful wedding, and it was a big wedding. We both sang in the choir, so it was really kind of fun. But I felt a little bit sorry for them. Now, at the Lake Theater, which we talked about a minute ago, even in the year 1934, they were still advertising in the local paper, the Lake Theater, where the talkies really talk. They were so proud of having talkies that they were still talking about that in 1934. And movies were such a big influence on all of us, not just kids, but adults and everywhere. It didn't make any difference across the country. Movies were big things, and we went to the movies every Friday night. And in the book of Good Luck on Your Downward Journey, it tells about the kids going to the movies. All the kids in our neighborhood, we'd stop at Arnold's Drug and buy some penny candy and pay our 10 cents to get in, and we always sat in the same seats, 10 rows from the front, right-hand side. And we figured those were our seats. If we got there and somebody else was sitting in them, they were sitting in our seats. We thought we owned those seats practically. And so on this particular night, the first thing they see on the screen is the Fox Movietone newsreel. And Lowell Thomas was the narrator. And in the sports section, Dizzy Dean, who's one of the greatest pitchers of all time, pitching for the Cardinals. Dizzy Dean was on a one-day strike, and he told the newsreel camera he's on strike because his brother Daffy, Paul, wasn't making enough money. Dizzy said that his brother was making $3,000 a year pitching for the St. Louis Cardinals, and he said, my brother is worth at least $5,000. And Dizzy was making $7,000 a year pitching for the Cardinals, and he told the newsreel camera he was worth twice that much. Now, the newsreel was shot the first week in June, and in the first week in June of 1934, Dizzy and his brother Daffy had each won 5 ball games for the St. Louis Cardinals. At the end of that year, 1934, between the two brothers, they had won 49 ball games and the World Series, and their total income was $10,000. Imagine that. The pitcher wouldn't even tie his shoes for $10,000 today. And Dizzy was a 30-game winner, and his brother was a 19-game winner. And they were pitching for $10,000 for the whole year. Well, then the kids see a movie, a corny movie about World War I aviators, and it's called The Eagle and the Hawk, and it stars 3 new movie stars, Cary Grant, Frederick March, and Carol Lombard. And so the kids watch the movie, and at the end of the movie, they go home, and the book takes you then 400 miles away to a movie theater in suburban Chicago. And a handsome young man with a little mustache has taken 2 girlfriends to the movies. And when they come out of the movies, there's a big sign on the side of on the wall of the small lobby, very much like the one in Excelsior, that said, "Coming to the Biograph Theater next week, Cary Grant, Frederick March, and Carol Lombard in a movie called The Eagle and the Hawk." 2 minutes later, that young man was dead. He'd been shot by 9 federal agents. He was public enemy number 1, and his name was John Dillinger. And he had done what hundreds of thousands of others had done on that same hot night, just like the kids in Excelsior. He'd gone to the movies. Everybody was going to the movies back in those days. They were a big influence on all of us back in those days. Well, I don't want to keep talking about the movies, but they were a big influence. When I go downtown Minneapolis today, the older I get, the more I think about what it was like back in the 30s when I was a kid. And I remember 2 things very vividly about downtown Minneapolis during the 1930s. One, a lot of men out of work with dark overcoats and gray felt hats. Everywhere. They were everywhere. And the other thing was streetcars. There were streetcars everywhere. You could go on a streetcar anywhere in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis or St. Paul, and get within 2 blocks of your destination. You could get on a streetcar at Lake Hennepin and go all the way to the fairgrounds if you wanted to, over in St. Paul. It was a wonderful mode of transportation. There were streetcars everywhere. And department stores. There are hardly any of them left anymore. But I wrote down some of them that I remember from the 1930s. And they'll be familiar to some of you who are old enough to remember this. Of course, there was Davis and Donaldson's and Powers, and the Leader. The Leader was the first department store in downtown Minneapolis to have an escalator. Morris L. Rothschild, Young Quinlan, Juster Brothers, Brown's Clothing, Thomas's, and Penny's. I don't know how many of you ever shopped at Penny's back in the 30s, but they did something that nobody else ever did, and they don't do it anymore. But when you gave them money for something, they didn't give you any change. They put the money in a little tube, and they stuck it up here overhead, and whoosh, away it went somewhere. And in about 2 minutes, whoosh, back it came. Some sort of pneumatic tube with your change in it. I always wondered where that went, and who did all that. But they don't do it anymore, but they did back in those days. And if you were having lunch in Dayton's Tea Rooms up in the top of Dayton's, and anybody had milk, it came from Boulder Bridge Farm, just out west of Excelsior, from their prize herd of cows.
That'd be on the 4th floor, probably.
Well, I think it was even higher than that, but I'm not sure. Anyway, those were things that I remember about downtown Minneapolis. And in the theater now, at the Orpheum Theater, all the big bands came to the Orpheum Theater. So you could see Tommy Dorsey or Jimmy Dorsey or Gene Krupa or Benny Goodman or Glenn Miller. They all had big bands, and they all came to the Orpheum, and they played between the movies. You'd see a movie, and then you'd see a half-hour stage show with one of those big bands. Then you'd see the movie over again, and they did that all day long. And they did about five or six performances. And so as teenage musicians, we'd go in on Saturdays and catch the first stage show, watch the movie, and then stay for the second stage show so we could see Tommy Dorsey and all those others, because that's the only time we ever saw them. We didn't have television or anything like that. So to see them on stage was really exciting. And when I was about 8 or 9 years old, my mom took me down in about 1928, 1929. My mom took me downtown Minneapolis to the Minnesota Theater, which later became the Radio City Theater in downtown Minneapolis. She took me to the Minnesota Theater to see live, on stage, the greatest cowboy of all time, Tom Mix. Tom Mix and his horse Tony were on stage. Thought we were in heaven. And then following that stage show, Eddie Dunstetter, playing the mighty Wurlitzer organ, would rise out of the orchestra pit. And on the screen, we followed the bouncing ball. Do you remember that? The bouncing ball was a community sing. And they had all the lyrics on the screen, and then the ball bounced the way you sing. And so during the Depression, we all hung on to each other and followed the bouncing ball and sang songs like button up your overcoat when the wind blows free, take good care of yourself, you belong to me, eat an apple every day, get to bed by 3. Well, anyway, it went on and on and on. But and it was exciting. It was fun for us to do, to follow the bouncing ball. And talking about money values from that day, a couple of good examples. In the book of Good Luck on Your Downward Journey, which is somewhat autobiographical, the 12-year-old kid from the poor family, and that's me, needs glasses. And so I go to town with my mom on the bus on a hot July day in 1934. And we go to an optometrist called Kindy's. It was located on Nicollet Avenue between 8th and 9th Street. And I remember this, it was right next to the Mayflower Donut Shop. Boy. Anyway, we went there, and sure enough, the kid needs glasses. Now, it's not only a medical crisis, it's a financial crisis, because it's going to cost $8. And the optometrist is quick to assure the mother that there are terms. She doesn't have to pay the $8 all at once. So we go ahead and order the glasses. So now, here's my mom and myself in town. We don't have much money. We don't get into Minneapolis very often. And so we decided we'd celebrate. We'd have lunch in downtown Minneapolis. Now, for some of you seniors, I don't know if you can guess where we might have had lunch if we didn't have much money. And, pardon? Well, some people would say Kresge's or Woolworth's, but most people would say the Forum. We go to the Forum, which was a cafeteria located on 7th Street between Nicollet and Hennepin. And we skipped all the good stuff because we can't afford that. We have the cheapest thing on the menu. This is true. Chow mein. It's 13 cents a plate. And the mother and the boy have the chow mein, and they each have a tea biscuit or a roll of some kind. She has some tea and he has a glass of milk. And they talk about the glasses and other things. And when they get ready to leave, the mom pays the bill. It's 42 cents for lunch. 42 cents for lunch. Can you imagine that? Well, how many of you have grown up in small towns or on the farm, things like that? Oh, there's a number of people. Well, I want to read something to you. In the book Excelsior, there's an editor who was the editor of the Minnetonka News back in the late 1800s, about 1898. And I love that. Here's a quote from this editor. It says, the longer we run a newspaper and write about people and events, the more we realize how utterly impossible it is to scratch every man on the spot where he itches the most. You can't do it. Anyway, this guy could have made $1 million today writing copy for television. All weekly newspapers back in those days, and I can tell you from experience, because I was in the newspaper business, and especially the weekly newspaper business. Weekly newspaper editors ran something called reader ads. They were very unethical. What they did was they would write an ad in the same type of the news story, and then they'd drop it in the middle of the news story. So you'd be reading a news story, and then all of a sudden you'd be reading about Phillips Hardware or something else. And, it was kind of like television commercials in a way. Anyway, this guy could have made $1 million writing copy. I want to read, this is a series of ads I found that were reader ads. They were dropped into the news stories. The first one said, girls, if you wish to be June bride with red lips and laughing eyes and a lovely complexion, take Rocky Mountain tea this month. 35 cents, ask your druggist. That wasn't a bad ad. Then the next one said, taken this month keeps you well all summer. Rocky Mountain tea made by the Madison Medicine Company, 35 cents. Then I found this one that said, you'll never get tired, fagged out, disappointed, unhappy, or make mistakes in marriage if you use Rocky Mountain tea. And the last one said, it takes a severe matrimonial frost to kill the orange blossoms used in making Rocky Mountain tea. So I went to an old friend of mine who was a retired druggist to find out what Rocky Mountain tea was. It was a laxative. I was a school patrol boy, and later on as a Boy Scout, I ushered at Memorial Stadium, and I watched all those national championship teams of Bernie Bierman's in 1934 and 35 and 36 and 40 and 41. And there's a wonderful story that, there were so many big names back in those days, all these All-Americans who played for the Gophers. Players like Pug Lund and Sheldon Visey and George Roscoe and Bud Wilkinson, Andy Uhrman, Harold Van Every from Wayzata, and Sonny Frank and Bruce Smith, Ed Whitsett, you could go on and on. All these All-Americans. And in 1935, the Chicago Tribune sponsored the first All-Star football game. And that was between the college All-Stars and the champion of the National Football League, which almost every year was the Chicago Bears. And so they played at Soldier Field, and Sheldon Visey and Pug Lund, two All-Americans, a halfback and a fullback, were selected from Minnesota to go down and play in that All-Star game. And so they went down there just to show you that there were shenanigans going on way back as early as the 1930s. These two young football players in Minnesota went down to play in the All-Star game. And on the very first day of practice, they walked into the locker room and looked around, and here were these All-Americans from all over the country getting together because they were going to play the National Football League's pro champion. And they all crowded around the two kids from Minnesota because they were playing on a national championship team. And they all had one question to ask these two kids. How much are they paying you to play at the University of Minnesota? And Sheldon Visey said, we told them we weren't getting anything at all. Nobody paid us. But those All-Stars couldn't believe it. They almost laughed him out of the locker room to think that two All-Americans on a national championship team weren't getting money under the table or something. So there were shenanigans going on even back then. And also, Bernie Bierman, I believe, had been coaching at Tulane before he came home to the University of Minnesota, which was his alma mater. And so he arranged for a game between Minnesota and Tulane in the mid-30s, about I can't tell you exactly when, but in the mid-30s. And so Tulane came to town to play the Gophers. And on the Gopher squad were two black kids. One, Dwight Reed, who was a splendid end, and Horace Bell, who was an All-American guard and a place kicker. And when Tulane came to town from the South with their all-white team, they wouldn't let those two kids play that day in the game. And nobody ever said anything. Nobody said it was wrong. Nobody said, wait a minute, you can't do that. Everybody just accepted it. Of course, today Tulane would be an all-black team practically when they came, but not back in those days. They wouldn't let them play because they were black. Well, the biggest sporting event of the year, every year in the 1930s and the 1940s, was the state high school basketball championship. Back in the days when there were only 8 teams, not a million of them, but just 8 teams, large and small. And everybody, you couldn't buy a ticket for it. You couldn't get a ticket to Williams Arena. They were always sold out. And everybody went to see some small school beat some large school like Minneapolis Edison or Austin or Rochester or one of those. And so there were some small towns who became famous because they had a high school basketball team that went to the state tournament and won. I'll give you the names of about 3. Mountain Lake would be one. Edgerton was another. They just had a 50-year reunion this last year. Lynn was another, little dinky small town. We all went to see them play hoping they were going to knock off somebody that was big. Well, anyway, when I grew up in Excelsior, there were no street signs or house numbers. And you identified the house by who lived there. This is the old Johnson place, this is the Gear house. So, and they seemed to live there forever. They got a better job, they didn't move to a better neighborhood. They lived in that house all the time. And Patty and I have been living in the same house now for 56 years. And the other day she said, yes, one of these days I gotta wash the windows. At any rate, someday that's going to be known as the old Williams place, I'm sure. And but you identified the house by who lived there. So you got your mail at the post office, either in a post office box or general delivery. So most of us couldn't afford a post office box, so we got our mail general delivery, which meant you went to the general delivery window and they had your mail all sorted alphabetically by names of families. So, you know, I could get a letter that was mailed to me, it would have said Bob Williams, Excelsior, Minnesota. That's all it would have said. And, but it was different then than it is nowadays. And somebody gave me this definition of a small town. In a small town, only in a small town, in that time period, back in the 1930s, could you call your family doctor by his first name? You called him Milt Seifert or Lane Airy or George Hemsey or whatever. But you called the school janitor Mr. He was always Mr. And that defined that time period. Well, I wanted to, oh yes. I remember when Patty and I were first, you know, we were young marrieds and we were just beginning to have children, and we'd listen to WCCO radio every morning, kids getting ready for school and that sort of thing, and Howard Viking was on. And they played music, but we just celebrated last October our 63rd wedding anniversary, but we were listening to Howard Viking, and one morning he said, we want to congratulate Mr. and Mrs. Olaf Johnson in War Road, Minnesota on their 60th wedding anniversary. Patty and I looked at each other and said, 60 years? Ah! Now we're going to be 64 next October. Anyway, and this could only happen in a small town where everybody recognizes you and knows who you are. If you lived, if you were in Minneapolis in the 1930s and the 1940s, if you were in Minneapolis and you missed the last bus to Excelsior at midnight, or if you didn't have enough money for the bus, all you had to do was go down to Lake and Hennepin in the Uptown District and stand in front of the Rainbow Cafe, right on the corner. And it didn't make any difference whether it was at 10 o'clock at night or 1 o'clock in the morning. If you stood there long enough, somebody from Excelsior would drive by that corner, because you had to go by that corner to get onto Highway 7. Somebody would come by, stop the car, honk the horn, open the back door and say, jump in, Bob, we'll give you a ride home. Never failed. I never had to walk anywhere. I always went down to that corner. Well, I brought some books along. Nobody's required to buy anything, but I brought Good Luck on Your Downward Journey, which is the book that was about 1934, and I brought some Excelsior books, which are they're very early, 1887. Even if you don't want to buy, if you want to buy one, I'll be glad to sign it for you. But even if you don't want to buy one, just come and take a look at them. They have photographs in them that help the reader visualize what they're reading about. So I hope you'll do that. But in the meantime, I think I finally got my act together. as I told you before, I love Charlie Brown stories. And there's, the one I remember is Charlie and Lucy are on a cruise ship, and they get up in the morning, and they get up on deck with their deck chairs under their arm. And Lucy says, "Which way are you going to face your deck chair this morning, Charlie Brown?" You know, some people face their deck chair towards the bow of the ship so they can look to the future and see where they're going. Of course, others face their deck chair towards the stern so they can look and see where they've been and reflect on the past. So which way are you going to face your deck chair this morning, Charlie Brown? And Charlie Brown said, "I don't know. I've never been able to get mine unfolded." So I'd like to think I've finally got my deck chair unfolded and know where I'm going. You've been a neat audience, and it's been a pleasure for me to come today. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.